If we in any way want to do better or do history better, we have to be courageous.
That's why it's essential that we acknowledge the people upon whose backs this country was founded.
The more people understand someone else's perspective, the more likely they are to listen.
We're going to make a better future for ourselves. We need to.
I hope that in 30 or 40 years that conversations like this will not be necessary. I hope in 30 or 40 years we will look at each other and see each other as Americans.
I think that once people really know the history, I think then people will begin to have respect for one another.
This is not just Black history. This is America's story.
Welcome to Virginia, the mother of presidents. The Commonwealth produced the most commander-in-chiefs by any state, with 8 Virginians taking the office. And nestled along the Blue Ridge Mountains stands the homes of 2 of those presidents and founding fathers, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Men who cemented themselves in American history for their great deeds, but you can't talk about their contributions without talking about all of their story. Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, is renowned for its beauty.
When I walk around these grounds, I know I'm walking in the footsteps of the people who preceded me, who are the foundation for the life I have.
Gail Jessup White is the Public Relations and Community Engagement Officer at Monticello and says they've worked to tell an accurate story about Jefferson's life, the good and the bad that wasn't always taught.
We tell the truth about American history. We, or at least I call myself a myth buster. And that's some of what we do here. So uncovering or discovering this truth has been part of my journey and part of Monticello's journey as well, to tell a complete story of what happened here on this mountaintop.
As the 3rd president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson is known for writing the Declaration of Independence, buying the Louisiana Purchase, the creation of the University of Virginia, and many more accomplishments. But he was also a slave owner living here atop a mountain in Charlottesville. Brandon Dillard is the manager of historic interpretation at Monticello. He started working here in 2011 and says at the time, many didn't know about terms like systemic racism, but the killing of Trayvon Martin in 2012 changed that, as well as the interest in the stories of all those who called Monticello home.
People began asking questions that were much more pointed about how skin color and slavery are related in this country and what that means for us 200 years later.
They've been able to tell those stories through Jefferson's well-documented notes and letters, as well as archaeology. From the child-sized fingerprints baked into the bricks on the outside of the house to the original kitchen they found, there's many ways they're working to tell these stories about life here.
Far too long, the way that American history has been taught is though that is a few stories about a few great white men. And the reality is most of us are not lucky enough to be born owning everything. But what that means is that for a lot of people, they identify with this singular narrative. But maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we have more in common with the people who lived and labored on this plantation who weren't the famous man who was born with everything handed to him. And I think that we have so many stories here that we're able to tell, and they range quite a bit.
For Jessup White, sites like the Discovered Kitchen moves her. It was a place where her ancestor, Peter Hemmings, learned to cook from his brother James, who trained with French chefs while serving Jefferson during his time in Paris.
Do you know why he learned to cook? Because James Hemmings had negotiated with Jefferson his freedom if he taught someone else the art of French cookery. So those brothers stood there, so much love between them, that one brother would be free while the other would remain enslaved. It was my ancestor who remained enslaved. That is the most moving space in this huge landscape for me, because I empathize and feel what my ancestor went through. And I admire them, respect them, and feel compelled to share their stories.
But Jessup White's story isn't uncommon for those who can trace their roots back to slavery, but they are complex. Her own story started years ago.
For many, many years, when I was just a young girl, a teenager, I heard that we were descendant from Thomas Jefferson. Grew up in Washington, D.C. I was incredulous when I heard this story because I'm Black, and at the time, I wasn't taught, like so many other Americans, that Jefferson owned human beings.
That started her research into discovering the myth she'd been told was actually true.
I'm Thomas Jefferson's 5 times great-granddaughter through one of his great-great-grandsons. One of his great-great-grandsons was my great-grandfather, and he had relations with my great-grandmother, who was a Hemmings descendant. She was the great-granddaughter of a man named Peter Hemmings, who was Sally Hemmings' brother. Do you see how complex these stories are? And what this tells us is the overlaying, the generational relationships, or relations I'd rather call them, that existed between the enslaved people and the people who owned them.
Sally Hemmings and the Hemmings family were owned by Thomas Jefferson, and she birthed at least 6 of his kids, 4 who survived to adulthood. Hearing that is needed along with his list of contributions, and those here hope people can understand that.
I'm not sure if I understand why anybody would talk about the past if they're not telling the truth about the past. But I do think that a lot of people have an idea of what history is, and they think that history should be some sort of glorification of people who came before, and a non-critical approach to understanding how people live their lives. That doesn't seem like history to me. That seems like something else.
And just about an hour away at another plantation in Orange County, similar work is being done.
James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe and any other member of the founding generation that came from the South, they could not have done what they did. They could not have lived the lives that they lived. They would not have had the time, they wouldn't have had the money, they wouldn't have had the time and the leisure to acquire these extraordinarily good educations, and then to have the freedom to ponder self-government and individual liberty and political philosophy and how they would create a new country. If they hadn't had the leisure that the work of unpaid people that they held in bondage, were doing to support them, they would not have been able to found this country. So that's why it's essential that we acknowledge the people upon whose backs this country was founded. Their work was absolutely just as important as any work that Madison did in studying and writing and influencing the Constitution. The people who were working right out the window where he was sitting made it possible.
Montpelier is home to the 4th president and writer of the Constitution, James Madison. His great-grandparents moved to this land in the 1720s, but this place was also home to 300 enslaved people. Elizabeth Chu is the executive vice president and chief curator for the Montpelier Foundation. She says the site hasn't been open to the public as long as Monticello, but in 2019, the descendant community of those enslaved here formed their own committee to be their own voice. They're now working to be represented equally on every level at the foundation. Their voices and faces were also seen in the award-winning Mere Distinction of Color exhibit launched in 2017. And in 2020, Montpelier created the Naming Project, a virtual exhibit.
We have been able to piece together a remarkable number of stories because we set out about 10 years ago to create a virtual database of primary source documents. And so just by following the names of people as they're mentioned in correspondence, we're able to know what people's jobs and lines of work were. Of course, the best known person to be enslaved here was a man named Paul Jennings, who ran the household and was Madison's manservant in the latter years of his life. And he actually wrote an autobiography later on. And we also know that a number of the slaves were literate. And for example, Dolly Madison had a enslaved lady's maid named Sarah Stewart, who went by Sookie. And she had 4 children. And we know that after Sookie had given her entire life to Dolly Madison sold Sookie and her children.
The work has also taken physical form with excavations to provide a more accurate depiction of life here, like these slave dwellings.
It was work to excavate all of the structures that were right here beside the Madison house, and these were all slave dwellings and work buildings. And right beside the house, so the people who lived here were basically under surveillance 24/7. So we did very careful archaeology, we did very careful architectural study of surviving structures, and then we've rebuilt the 6 buildings that were here.
But this work here and at Monticello isn't always received well by those who visit.
So we still find today, and all of our sister sites do too, that many of our visitors, especially those in older demographics, they want to hold on to the traditional story of American exceptionalism, that everything about the founding of our nation was great and glorious, and they don't want to hear anything that they think of as being negative. And they see many times visitors who push back on our interpretation, they think that by talking about slavery we are tearing down, dismissing, disparaging the founding fathers. And what I say we're doing is we're just telling the whole story. We're not leaving out a significant piece of the story because most of the founders were slaveholders. That is a fact. And that is just as much a part of our founding as the Constitutional Convention. And so I say by telling the whole story, I'm not taking anything away from James Madison. James Madison still did everything that he did, but he also was a lifelong slaveholder, never freed a single slave.
Chu hopes that by doing this, they can help people understand the complex makeup of our country.
One of the things that I think is really important is to understand where we are now in this nation in terms of many cultural and racial issues. Those can be directly linked back to the institution of slavery, and by the fact that, in very many ways, we've never gotten over it. And I think learning from the past can help to inform the present.
It's a sentiment also felt by Jessup White, who hopes that it will make America a better place.
I hope that in 30 or 40 years that conversations like this will not be necessary. I hope in 30 or 40 years we will look at each other and see each other as Americans and love each other as individuals and respect each other. I hope that we're not visiting this conversation in 30 or 40 years.
To make that happen, Jessup White will continue to tell impactful stories. She recently released a book, Reclamation, Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson, and a descendant's search for her family's lasting legacy, documenting her story. She's proud of her work and also the work Monticello is doing to tell the story.
I know that we lead by example. There are stories now being told all over the country that are not unlike the stories we have here at Monticello. It is our goal to inspire others, not just other museums, but people. It is my goal through a book I've written to inspire people to investigate their own histories and their own backgrounds, to do their own genetic research, to understand the value of who they are and who their families were. So absolutely, I do believe that we lead by example, and I am so proud of the work we do here.
These two plantations are reminders that pretty things can hold ugly truths, but they don't have to hold us back from healing. By using the famous figures who lived here, it helps us understand why things are the way they are today and how we can act to move forward.
Just like America, just below the surface, there's something there that's harder that we have to grapple with. And if we're going to make a better future for ourselves, we need to.